Morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks to Robert for putting this thing together. My name's Steve Llano. I'm from St. John's University in New York City, and I want to tell you a little story to kind of start things off for my presentation. It's the story of New York Congressional District 14, where their primary election made national headlines because of a primary race. Now, being a citizen of New York City, I'm well aware that all of our elections are decided in the Democratic primary. The actual election day doesn't matter. The Democratic primary is where you vote if you want to decide who's going to win. So in this district, we had long-term Congressman Joe Crowley, who was seen as next in line for Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. He was challenged by someone who ran an openly socialist platform, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Cortez handily defeated her in the primary and will probably win election to the Congress. They didn't have a debate. They talked about having a debate, but as you know, the only people obligated in American politics to debate are presidents. And it's questionable whether they're obligated to debate. Only recently we've kind of worked that out. So the debate wasn't necessary. The voters tended to decide just fine. But someone else noticed there wasn't a debate and decided that there should be one. Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro on his television show challenged Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to a debate where he said they can talk about the issues and offered her $10,000 to her campaign if she would come on the show and debate with him. His model of debate is interesting. I would love to debate her because I have one question for her. He said, name an industry you would not nationalize. Which ones could the government not run and why? All right, can she name any of them? Kind of insulting for an invitation, and Ocasio-Cortez's campaign took it directly like that. She tweeted, just like catcalling, I don't owe a response to unsolicited requests from men with bad intentions. So I guess that's a no. This is an interesting case study for me as someone who's a scholar of rhetoric and debate because it opens up the question, what do we think? It's like a shadow box or like a model of what do we think debates do? How do debates function in society? Here we see debates as either expose or something that's really kind of a bad thing that might have bad stuff inside it. In fact, the model most people have for political debates is this. It's a Trojan horse, a gift that you have to accept in wartime that might be full of enemies just waiting to catch you sleeping. This model of debate is echoed by scholars who can't seem to make up their mind about what political or election debates are about. Here's a smattering of different scholarship about election debates. They're joint press conferences, the famous attribution of Sidney Krause, who has written the most about electoral debates of any scholar. Catherine Hall Jamieson and David Birdsell say its sustained consideration of important issues is best difficult when topics shift rapidly, the emphases are determined by non-contestants, and the time is short. And finally, George Farah indicates that debate contests have shifted away from fundamental issues to narrow issues, mostly because of the control of the presidential debates by the Commission on Presidential Debates, a bipartisan, neutral organization full of all the senators and representatives who lost their elections. And also like attorneys to old presidents and stuff like that. It's a strange organization, but this is our model for election debates, and it seems odd that this is it. Here's an example of the kind of restrictions that we think are normal and okay for debates. This is from the recent Texas Senate debates from Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke, where these were the rules for the debate. A question of 90 seconds to answer, 60 seconds for response, and 30 seconds for rebuttal. And I think 15 minutes up here is hard. I'm not even running for anything. My position's secured. I don't have to beat anybody. But this is what we expect as normal. Why do we think of this as normal, and why do we think of debates as operating in this way? Well, part of our cultural baggage for this needs to be removed. We think of debates as zero-sum games that have winners and losers, that are full of trickery but are necessary, that have purity concerns, and that are so incredibly important that in 1988, the Merkel Commission, something Sidney Krause points out, suggested that campaign finance accessibility should be tied to willingness to debate. That is, you won't get campaign finance money unless you debate. This never became policy, but it was suggested in 1988, and I wonder what the conditions were, I guess, in the Dukakis-Bush campaigns that made them feel like this might be a necessity. Maybe we could think about debates differently. Maybe if we thought about debates as being an older form of rhetorical discourse, not a deliberative form meant to solve a problem, but one where we celebrate values, something that connects the best man's toast at a wedding to the Athenian funeral panegyric, epideictic rhetoric, the rhetoric where we consolidate our values and say who we are and what we stand for. I think if we think of electoral debates this way, we have a much, much easier time or clearer time of evaluating them and making them a productive part of our American election system. This book is, it's hard to understate this book, but since I have 15 minutes, I'm going to do a really good job of it. This book is amazing, amazing book that gets overlooked by most scholars. And this is Chaim Perlman and Lucy Ulbricht-Stitica's understanding of the epideictic. I'm going to show you a lot of walls of text for the rest of the presentation. I hope you're excited about that. What we want to pull from this about the epideictic is that these values are normally not contested in our daily lives. We think of them as identity. We think of them as who we are. And what the epideictic rhetor does is bring them forward, because at any moment, there's a number of different values one could have and a number of different ways one could identify. As an American, as someone from West Lafayette, as someone from Indiana, as someone from New York, as someone who has Italian background or Spanish background. What the epideictic rhetor does is take that field of possibility and bring forward the ones to say, right here, right now, this is who we are. This is what we stand for. This is what matters. And that is the thing that happens in these electoral debates. They're not discussing policy. They're not discussing facts or who's right or wrong. They're saying, I can stand in for local values at the national level. I can represent both your national feelings and support the local. And that's what they're doing. This book has a lot more to say about epideictic rhetoric, but we must move on. Epideictic rhetoric is operationalized in what they call dissociative argument, which is the theory that whenever there are incompatibilities in my opponent, I say, it's not that they're wrong, because that's distasteful. I say, well, they're just not really who you think they are. And they talk about this in terms of the basic appearance-reality pair, which is an incredibly basic move in argumentation, where you say, my opponent appears to be in favor of families, but in reality, let's look to the record. I appear to be just a simple businessman, but let me tell you a little bit more about my family life, what I support and what I value. This is the paradigmatic structure of argumentation that Perlman and Ulbricht-Stitica discover in their vast inductive study that goes across law, literature, science, you name it. They have examples of it in this book. The appearance-reality pair is something that electoral debaters in congressional debates very specifically, and there was a great example last night. I can't remember what I was watching something on C-SPAN last night. Florida. Yeah, it must have been. It must have been. There was a great example of this where it was the congressman couldn't remember the name of or kept calling her Nancy Pelosi. Was that Florida? It was a congressional debate. I'm going to put it into the paper because it's fantastic. But it's like, here's somebody who can't even remember my name and you expect them to represent us in Congress. Excellent example of dissociative argument. You think they're smart. They're actually really just a player. They're actually really just a trickster. And those things are always concerns that we have when we're facing debate. So if epideictic argument is the way I think we should look at these debates, how do we understand what happens? How do we understand the persuasive effect of them? Well, we turn to this scholar, Kenneth Burke, whose work is very much like one of these people who believes, I don't understand these people, who believe that they have a theory that could practically explain the totality of human motivation. There's very few people at this level, Marx, Freud, Burke, who think that they have a theory that explains all of human motivation. He calls his dramatism. And dramatism is the idea that theater doesn't mirror life, life mirrors theater. Literature is equipment for living. We look to the theater, we look to our dramas, we look to stories to show us how we should act in the face of particular motivation. Two ideas here I want you to think about when we look at these clips. Identification division, which is one movement for Burke, and consubstantiality. Identification and division is the idea that we pretend to be, or we hope to be a certain way, and we think we are that way, but we're merely moving towards that way as a continuous movement. We're always trying to identify with the institutions, ideas, and people who we admire and respect. At the same time, we are dividing from other identities. This is a double movement that we can't avoid. Consubstantiality is the idea that I'm always trying to be like the people I want to be like. So this quote over here, you give the signs of such consubstantiality by deference to an audience's opinions, is what it should say under there. It got cut off, I think. I think it's because I don't have a Mac. But the idea is that all of these things are posited. So when a candidate says, we believe in families first, or we believe in a balanced budget, they're positing that as existent before them, but they rhetorically craft that. They're bringing that forward epideictically and saying, here's what we believe. So with this in mind, I've created my own sort of system for trying to figure out how to look at these debates. Here are some of the postulates that I came up with that we're going to look at some video here to determine how they go. First, congressional election debates are about creating identification and consubstantiality within audiences. An audience is one thing for sure. It's eligible voters, possibly. There might be people there who can't vote, who just come for the show. But we can assume that pretty safely. But after that, it's up to candidates to decide what they're going to construct that audience to be and who that audience is going to be. They're about values, not facts. This is very confusing because we all like to go to politicalfactcheck.org or whatever. These organizations also pointed out that the $10,000 campaign contribution that Ben Shapiro was offering to Ocasio-Cortez would violate federal finance law. So it couldn't happen even if they agreed to it in the first place. But these fact-checking sites, we go to these and we think that that's going to resolve it for us. But I would submit to you that facts are used as value points. Like when Ted Cruz challenges Beto O'Rourke in the first debate and says, the Washington Post determined that you were a liar. It shows that he's associating himself not so much with the truth, but so much so with the value of what the audience would think about the Washington Post and what the audience would think about somebody who says they didn't say something when it's a matter of public record. So facts play as values. They're about the ability of the candidate to speak from the center of both local and national values. This is incredibly crucial in the age of Trump. We're going to see an example from the 2016 election, and then we're going to look at the special election in Pennsylvania's 18 district, which was after Congressman Tim Murphy had to resign. There was a special election, and we'll see how that discourse changes a little bit there about how they have to deal with the local and national conflicting. And they're meant to create more discourse to unsettle, not to settle. I want you to think about debates as kicking up a number of different things. They're meant to produce discourse amongst voters and people, not to say, oh, that's the policy, let's stop talking. That would be the worst thing in a campaign. You want people talking about your candidate. You want people talking about what they did and what they said and what they acted on. Sometimes it just doesn't go your way if the candidate maybe goes off the rails, but you do want people talking. You don't want to settle issues. You want to create them. It's the opposite of the way we're taught all of our lives to think about the function of debate. So let's look at how we're going to evaluate these things. I came up with 4 terms that I think you can identify most discourse with. Framework, the first term, is about what exists, what's out there, what's the exposition of the scene according to the candidate. Principle is, what are the values I hold to? What are my values? What do I hold? What do I believe? Vision is, how am I going to enact those values when I get elected or reelected? What am I going to? And action is, here are the actions I've taken in the past, or here are the things that I'm doing that show you that my principle and action are actually in a correct ratio, and I can accomplish this. So these are my 4 terms. I just kind of came up with them. I came up with them because I write a lot on this blog called Election Debates during the campaign debates, and I write, and it helps me write reviews of these debates that I think are helpful. Instead of telling people who won or lost, which is the way journalists always are at these things. Like, who won the debate, professor? I'm like, well, it's hard to say. They're not really structured the way we think. And they're like, that's very nice, professor, but who won the debate? So this is why I don't really talk to journalists that much anymore about this kind of stuff, because I feel like I'm just doing a disservice to American politics, quite honestly. When I say, well, I've studied debate for 20 years and it doesn't help anybody. So let's get into some of the action. Example 1 is from Minnesota's 3rd Congressional District 2016 debate. This is a district outside of Minneapolis that seems to be pretty affluent. I don't know if anybody from this area, but the debate was between Eric Paulson, who's the guy running for re-election, and Terry Bonoff, who's a state representative. And I have a clip here of Terry Bonoff's opening statement to kind of show you how I do this analysis and what we can say about it. And so let's see if we can watch that. I hope this works.
The U.S. candidates of the House for Minnesota's 3rd state Democratic politics.
Sorry, it didn't work right.
Including several, and was first up the state legislature. We have Representative Eric Paulson and State Senator Terry Bonoff here from the 3rd District. Thank you both for coming in for this debate, which, as we just saw from our last one, we really have more of a conversation here. So thank you.
That's an interesting point I make in the paper, is how the journalists deflect and deny that there's actually a debate happening. We don't have a debate here. We talk. We hang out. We're cool. We hang out with each other. We're cool. There's a lot of debate divestment that happens in our culture. We are really, really torn in this paradox where we think debate is an essential part of American political life. And then at the same time, we are paranoid about the Trojan horse model. We're like, this is going to be bad. There's going to be a lot of blood. People are going to get hurt. So we have this huge paradox, and we try to resolve it by saying, well, we have to have this debate, but we're going to do it differently. It's sort of like if you're like, well, we're going to have a dinner party, but it's not going to be formal. And that's kind of the way the discourse handles it. And I think every single journalist in every single debate makes this move. No one says, we're here for a debate and we're just really going to rip each other apart. No one does that. But that's the fear that operates in their mind. It's really kind of funny.
Well, for coming in. Senator Llano, let's start with the opening statement.
Well, thank you. I'm running for Congress because I believe in the promise of our country and its people. I think it is more important now than ever before that we elect courageous leaders, leaders who can bring people together on both sides of the aisle together to tackle our very real tough challenges. In the Minnesota Senate, I've earned a reputation for doing just that. As a pro-business Democrat, I worked with the Minnesota Chamber to create the Minnesota Pipeline Project. That program was really about getting rid of student debt and addressing the skills gap. It connected students with employers. They get on-the-job training. They get paid wages while they're getting the degree. When they're done, they actually have a job. That work has been written about twice in the last year by Forbes magazine. It's that kind of bold leadership that I would bring with me to Congress, where it is sorely lacking. You know, Congressman Paulson, you've been there for 8 years, and I think you've enabled part of that gridlock and that obstructionist Congress. And I also believe that you have voted too often on the wrong side of history with the extreme part of the right-wing part of your party. And so I believe that I have the values and the vision to represent this district. I was proud to be endorsed by ECM Publishers, and they're the group that has all of the local community newspapers. And what they said when they endorsed me is that I represented in my candidacy real hope and change. And so I have been a courageous leader in the business world, in the Minnesota Senate, and I would be that in Washington. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's, in the interest of time here, we'll maybe just go to Paulson next. Let's look at a couple of things she said. I'm running for Congress because I believe in the promise of this country and its people. That's a principal statement. That work has been written about twice in last year by Forbes magazine, talking about her jobs program. That's action. And it's that kind of bold leadership that I will bring to Congress where it's solely lacking vision. What's missing here from Bonoff's opening statement is framework, and Paulson is very eager to supply it. This one's going to work, hopefully.
Senator Paulson?
Thank you, and thanks for hosting the debate tonight with KSTP. I'm running for Congress once again. Now's the time that Minnesota expects its elected leaders, more than at any other time, to work across the aisle bipartisanly, transcend partisan politics. And I've got a great track record of doing that. I'm going to continue to do that. Whether it's repealing the medical device tax, which is focusing on keeping high-paying jobs right here in the state, high-paying jobs that are so critical in all of Minnesota. I worked on that with Senator Klobuchar, and I was persistent. It took 5 years to get that across the finish line, to suspend that tax. So sometimes it can take a while, or sometimes there may be an issue that moves quicker, such as stopping anti-human trafficking or sex trafficking. Also a very bipartisan issue, where we were able to get that done in less than a year. It's literally saving lives. And recently I passed a missing children bill. That will help now find missing children and now help put sex offenders behind bars. And so we're at a time now with partisan gridlock, with partisan politics. I want to continue to be part of a constructive solution to move the ball forward. It's one of the reasons why I was endorsed by the Minneapolis Star-Tribune recently, why I'm endorsed by the business organizations such as NFIB or Twin West Chamber, for instance. And I'm going to continue to work along that mold. And I'm one of only 34 members this year that has had a bill signed into law from either party, of either body, by the president. And I think that's what Minnesotans expect, is that type of leadership. I'm going to continue to do that if I'm elected again next week.
Thank you, and thank you.
Okay. So let's look quickly at his statement. The first thing is he sets up the framework, which is here we are in Minnesota, and here's what Minnesotans expect. He puts that as a positive thing. This isn't argumentative. This is what exists. Now, of course, it is argumentative. All of us can see that we could disagree with that. But the way that you put it forward in the debate is this exists. And then he says, I've got a great track record of doing that. I'm going to continue to do this working together. So I've done this already. I'm going to continue to do it. That's my vision. And I've worked with Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar in the Senate to make these job bills happen, which shows the kind of action he does. If we compare this across between both of them, her principal needs framework for that. And so this is something you could say about this debate, to say, look at what's happening here. Look at how to improve that congressional argumentation. Or let's look at how we can compare these people together. Is that without a framework, if she's talking mostly about herself, without a framework statement or framework argument, then there's very little that you can do to compare. So I have a number of other examples. I know I'm a little over time, but I did want to close to say I think this framework is very useful for helping people, especially scholars, talk to students and others about the value of these political debates, because they don't function the way most people assume they're going to function. And using the four terms to help make sense of them and find comparative arguments with them is incredibly useful. This is a really important time to generate this kind of discourse, because the American political debate model is being exported as quickly as possible. The British leaders debate in a presidential style. The Canadian leaders are about to start doing it. We had the debate between Nigel Farage and Nick Clegg on the Brexit, on the UK Brexit, which was done in this presidential style. So thinking of these as policy-solving discursive moments is just to upend or to ruin the ability of these things to be a valuable part of American political discourse. So I think I'll leave it there. I have a number of other examples. If you want to talk to me later in the conference, I'm happy to show you more video than you'd like to see and talk about my ideas very much. But thank you so much for your sustained attention, and thanks for having me at the conference. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Farah Latif from George Mason University. So let's start with a story. Once upon a time, there was a magical land where everyone lived happily. They have found the magic auxiliary that that cured everything. Their flowers smelled better than ever before. Their skies were bluer than ever before. And they were more productive than ever before. The magic auxiliary fueled their pet dragon that can do so much in so little time. And then one day, they realized the dragon had gone rogue. They had some missing sheep. There were some scorch marks on the land here and there, but they ignored the problem. And then a day came when they could no longer ignore the problem. They went to the big king and they said, "Do something." And the king said, "There is no one powerful enough, strong enough to slay the dragon." They said, "Then make him not multiply. Let it be just one. We'll live with one." So that's how Kate Marvel of NASA's Goddard Center and Columbia University explains the story of climate change. That's her research, and just like we would not tell the story to our children at bedtime in a story where we're all villains, where there is no hero, and we will not happily live ever after. As adults, we don't want to hear this story, and we don't want to believe this story. That was her take on the badly done, but that was her story. And I thought, how insightful. That explains so much. So my research stemmed from wanting to understand when climate science is so clear, and we are all experiencing climate changes, and it's a human issue. Why is it then a partisan issue? And why do we not understand climate change or support it, right, as citizens? And this led me to to understanding this concept of political gaslighting. I'm sorry, it's too dark, but I'll read it out. Political gaslighting is the manipulative use of information with the aim of casting a person or a group of people to lose confidence in their beliefs about prospective facts they believe to be true. So the word gaslighting comes from British theater and American cinema, and eventually into clinical psychology, where it is used to explain case studies where a manipulative domestic partner can convince the person, the domestic partner who's maybe accusing them of infidelity or something, to be crying 5 minutes later, blaming themselves for being terrible human being. That's the phenomena. And since 2016, it has found its way into our political discourse. And it's been used to explain and describe a lot of political discourse, particularly in the newspapers. And I thought it should be dealt with. I thought it should be understood, so we know what's happening. And we are in this era of fake news and this post-truth era, which makes it okay to tell half-truths, halfway lies, semi-facts. We are okay with things that are less than facts, right? So I've converting from what I understood from, again, I'm so sorry, it's not visible, understanding what I learned from clinical psychology into political gaslighting, and particularly in climate change situation. So gaslighting is most successful when the gaslightee, the gaslighter rather, is charismatic, and when the gaslightees are isolated from facts. And that helped me understand the political situation, the climate change rhetoric, how this air of logical fallacies and emotional manipulation has created this environment where climate change deniers exist and thrive, where science is clear, scientists have consensus on what science on climate change is and what we need to do to avoid the worst harm. So I will go into it a little bit later, but why I got these 5 codes, rather 7 codes, but some of these are negative and disparaging speech about climate change, denialist attitude, something like these things have been going on for eons and they will continue to go on for eons. Conspiratorial discourse. I read that during the period of the dinosaurs, the Earth temperature was 30 degrees warmer. I read, right? We don't know where they read it. Instant demeanor, just feeling aggravated, the emotional, the bodily response of being not in touch with reality and not being present. Speaking and interrupting others, blaming, that's the easiest thing to do. We can blame the other political parties, we can blame China if nothing else works, right? Deflection and counter theories to truth. So a lot of times that includes, I am concerned with the amount of money and the impact of productivity, right? Deflecting. A defeatist attitude. Too late. There's nothing we can do about it, right? White Ayers described climate change as a partisan issue that has become a litmus test for whether someone is a good enough Republican right? And in terms of climate change, it has been explained as a story of the naked emperor who claimed to have been wearing a beautiful garment, and he goes out into his subject parading through the country, whereas he is in the nude, and people are looking at him and admiring his non-existent garment. We are cognitively tuned to believe people that we find charismatic, and the inability to know all the facts, right? The inability to be separated from the facts. And in this case, it was the inability of the public, of the subjects, to claim to be the wisest and the most noblest, right? Claim to know it all. They believed them and went along with the story, and that's kind of what's happening with climate change. We tend to partisan with the party that we support otherwise for other things. And that's happening, but the fact is that, and these are the 2018 statistics, that there are 7 in 10, 70% of Americans think global warming is happening. And just about half of them are sure that global warming is happening to them. And despite of that, there is quite a bit of inaction, particularly from the Republican side. And that took me into my first research question and hypothesis. And so for my research, I looked into Republicans who were part of the Climate Solutions Caucus. They have been called this, so this congressional caucus is designed to help educate those congressmen, and so they can find solutions for climate changes. What I noticed was there are LCV scores, which is based on how they have voted on issues of climate and environment, was very low. So it's a bipartisan group, so 45 Republicans and 45 Democrats. I was more interested in Republicans. So I'll go into my hypothesis first, because that's, I guess we can kind of put it aside then. So I wanted to find out whether Republicans with bad environmental voting records will be more likely to engage in political gaslighting about climate change than Republicans with good environmental voting records. So out of 45, my sample was of 9 by increments of 5. No one had a good voting record. The best was 23, and the least was 0. And multiple ones had a 0 LCV score, whereas good for Republican on average was about 97. So that's out of the way. But I wanted to see how Republicans who are there, that R.L. Miller calls them the climate peacocks. They are there for the show. They have pretty feathers that they show, and they are not there to do anything about it. That kind of seems to be the case, but I wanted to see how they engage in this acts of gaslighting. So I will go back here. All of these quotes have come from my sample, which is amazing because they are supposed to be helping climate, but they have extreme denialist attitude, extreme defeatist attitude. They have very negative and disparaging comments about climate change scientists, the climate change science. So for my research, I looked at their congressional website, whether they talk about climate change, whether they show their association with the caucus, Climate Solutions Caucus, or not. And I looked at their Twitter handle to see whether they engage in climate-related discourse. I found most of them not to include association with a Climate Solution Caucus on their congressional website. I see little engagement on Twitter, and I saw that the only time they talk about climate issues are in terms of environmental issues, which is typically what is the most threatening to them in their caucus. So, for example, Republicans in Virginia were concerned about the Chesapeake Bay cleanup, and Floridians were more concerned about the Everglades issue and rising sea levels, but nothing beyond that, not the core issues of greenhouse gas prevention or keeping our Primus agreement. All of those were lacking. So let me go back. Oops. So I wanted to finish with this one example. He is part of my sample and part of the Climate Solutions Caucus, just to give him a little benefit of the doubt that he joined recently. But regardless, there is an agreement that that the unsaid agreement when somebody joins a caucus that isn't the name, it's about finding solutions, right? And I was able to find at least 5 different codes that I come up with about political gaslighting in this example.
We had somebody here from the National Science Foundation, the head actually, who said she wasn't a scientist and so couldn't answer any questions. And I was just curious. I asked her how many ice ages she thought that this Earth had been through. I mean, everything I can gather, minimum of 3, maximum some say from 5 to 7. But I just wonder how many ice ages you think we've gone through.
Well, again, I don't remember off the top of my head. I think the numbers you mentioned are in the ballpark, but I would have to look at the record. The Earth has undergone climate changes throughout its entire history. The difference is that for most of that history, there weren't 7 billion people on the planet who needed to be fed, clothed, and kept prosperous. And the other difference is that the pace of change was generally much slower.
I'm running out of time. I'm aware of that. You know, obviously we've had global warming for a long time. You can't have one single ice age that encompasses 3 ice ages. We had to have warming periods between each one of those. And so that is a natural phenomenon. And, you know, just because we're alive now, the tectonic plate shifts aren't going to stop. The hurricanes, tsunamis aren't going to stop. The asteroid strikes aren't going to stop. These things are going on for eons. They're going to continue to go on for eons. What do you think the temperature was on Earth before the disappearance of the dinosaurs?
There have been periods when the temperature was 3, 4, 5 degrees Celsius warmer than it is now. The difference between the circumstances you're describing and the circumstance we're in now is the changes that are being imposed on the climate in substantial part as a result of human activity are faster than the ability of ecosystems to adapt, and maybe even more importantly, faster than the ability of human society to adapt. There are a lot of stresses, as you point out, that we can't control, but the stresses we can control that are imposing burdens on our society, we ought to think about controlling.
No doubt about that. And I don't think there's anyone, I haven't heard anyone say ever, from either side of the spectrum, that there's no such thing as climate change. I mean, we've had climate change since the day the Earth was formed, whenever that was, depending on whatever you believe. And we'll have climate change to the day the Earth implodes, whenever that is. The question is, how much of the climate change do you think is influenced by human behavior?
The climate change we are experiencing now, the climate change we've been experiencing for the last several decades, is, according to the Academies of Science, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, work on this largely due to human activities. We are superimposing on slow natural climate change a rapid human-induced climate change.
But as a percentage, like, let's say that you anticipate that climate would change X amount in a year without the existence of humans on it. How much more do you think, as a percentage of the change, is influenced by human behavior?
The natural changes which we understand and which are underway on a long-term basis as we speak would, if they were the only influences, be cooling the planet rather than warming it. We would be in a long-term cooling trend as a result of the natural forces affecting climate that we understand. We are instead in a warming trend, which suggests that human activity is overwhelmingly responsible for the difference. We would be having cooling based on natural forces. We are having
I
warming.
remember the 70s. That was a threat. We're going to have a cooling that's going to eventually freeze the planet, and that was the fear that before Gore invented the internet, you know, or the other terms. I'd read that during the period of the dinosaurs, the Earth's temperature was 30 degrees warmer. Does that seem fathomable to you?
30 degrees sounds like a stretch to me, but I will review the literature and get back to you.
Thank you, Dr.
Okay, so I see many, I don't know how many you've noticed, but the point of my paper is if we have congressmen who have these beliefs, who have this attitude toward climate change, we need to do better. We need to understand when we are gaslighted, how we are gaslighted, and how to counter it. We, as climate change communicators, we have to come up with better counter narratives. We have to come up with better understanding of what our environment, what our politicians, their discourse is doing to our environment. Right? Thank you.
Just want to get this up for you. And minimize you, and you are right here.
All right, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So the title has changed a little bit, but the subject matter is still the same, obviously. This is part of a larger project too, and I'll explain a little later that there's some quantitative information that's going to be supplementing the more qualitative stuff that I'll be discussing here today. So as an outline, the puzzle that is becoming increasingly less puzzling to us is about issues related to race and gender, political orientation, and Trump support. And so we'll be weighing in on that a bit, my co-author and I'm speaking on behalf of my co-author today. And we're actually going to be drawing a lot from the literature on norms, both the literature that comes in social psychological context, but also in the recent research in economics, looking at candidate support and race and norms and violations of norms. And so we have a norms-based argument to make about how you can make sense of African-American Trump supporters. Our research design for today will be the footage that we've gotten from a handful of cases where we get excerpts of outspoken African-American celebrities who say things that are consistent with some of the arguments that we are making about the importance of knowing about norms when making sense of Trump support among African-Americans. And we'll talk a little bit about how that framework allows us to reconsider the interplay between political orientation and racial identity. And the empirical analyses that will be coming forward later in a quantitative piece will be looking at the interaction between political orientation and racial identity. So, like I say, the not as puzzling research puzzle is that Republicans typically get between 8 and 12% of the black vote Of course, Obama blew that out of the water, but if you look at this stuff longitudinally, the trends are more steady than they are unusual, in the sense that you don't see large numbers of African Americans supporting presidential candidates who are Republican, and you see African Americans supporting in larger number presidential candidates who are Democrats. There was a blip up and a blip down during the Obama era, but the Trump era is actually more of a return to form than it is some aberration. Now, this was surprising to us, but the more we think about this, this is actually evidence of a trend where you can expect to see small but fairly stable numbers of African Americans who support Republican candidates during elections. A colleague of mine asked me if I thought this was the miner's canary when you think about Black Trump supporters, and I'm less inclined to think that. There may be realignment dynamics occurring in the future, but that remains to be seen. What we seem to get now is this idea that the Republican Party has for a while relied upon a small but relatively outspoken group of conservative, rightward-leaning African Americans to champion charges that are compatible with that party and compatible with that side of the ideological spectrum. If we dig even deeper into this and start looking at gender differences, we notice that compared to Black women, Black men typically tend to be around 3 times more likely to support the Republican candidate during presidential elections. That happened this time, and honestly, that happened the last time too. So you'll hear some very interesting media narratives about African American women being the stalwarts of the Democratic Party. And that is something that was relevant for this last election, and I would argue it's going to be relevant for future elections because it was relevant in previous elections. Again, this is a story about the stability of not only the race gap in the vote shares that Republican presidential candidates get, but also the stability of the gender gap in the vote shares that Republican presidential candidates get. And so this thing that seemed very puzzling to us is starting to look more settled than puzzling, but still very interesting. So why? I guess it's the question that we're interested in. So when we first got into this, we wanted to know what made Black Trump supporters tick. In other words, why to support? And this was important to us because we thought that if you were going to see a change in this pattern, that change would be apparent during the divisive rhetoric of the 2016 election, and we didn't see much of a change, right? So we wanted to know what's going on, what's underneath a lot of this stuff. And so we're actually drawing from this literature on norms, like I was telling you about. And a colleague of mine at Bowdoin wrote a piece recently about the importance of understanding party identification as a proxy for racial identification. In other words, people who used to say that it's not prejudice, it's politics, for example, are having a harder time actually making that work when talking about communities of color in general and African Americans in particular, because the connection between the two is becoming more and more clear. So this is not the data I'm using for the project, but this is from the American National Election Studies. I have the highlighted portion of this chart from the Obama era and up. And what we've noticed is that since 2008, the connection between political orientation, in this case, identifying with the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, and an African American's racial identification has increased in strength and has went in opposite directions. In other words, the people who are highly racially identified, that relationship is negative with people who are highly identified with being Republicans, and that relationship is positive with people who are highly identified with being Democrats. And so this merging or this overlap that seems to be more prevalent now than before when it comes to party identification, for example, as a measure of orientation of politics, and racial identification among African Americans suggests to us that there might be something to the literature on racial norms if you're thinking about the baseline expectations in communities of color and people who go outside of that willfully doing something we're going to call norm defection. And so what's the norm? Some recent survey evidence that I was actually involved in, where the NAACP this summer did a survey that had more than African Americans in it, had a substantial sample of African American respondents, and they've shown that if you want to think about what the standing expectations are when it comes to African American communities thinking about this administration, we have a lot of evidence suggesting that people who are African American have thought about the campaign for Donald Trump and the administration for Donald Trump in racialized ways, and in racialized ways that make it difficult for the current president to recruit African American rank and file voters because of that rhetoric and because of the perception of racialization that goes along with that rhetoric. And so if there's a norm, the norm would be don't trust Trump, right? And this is funny, but I think this really gets at the idea. So thank goodness for Kanye, right? So this is on a loop. Sorry, it's not bigger, but if you have a trained social science eye, I want you to look at the brother in the pea coat on the side, right? And it has everything that I'm talking about in it. It has this idea that Trump is happy to greet the president, whereas his friends like, what the hell's going on, right? He's visibly uncomfortable with what's happening. And I'm not saying that this is a concrete example of how this norm process works, but if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. So the question again, so like what's going on with the African Americans who support Trump? If we're thinking about this from the framework of norm defection, one way that we tried to get at this, my co-author and I, is we wanted to use excerpts that we think are settling upon certain ideas that we think are relevant for making sense of African American Trump supporters. So if the question is, why are Black Trump supporters supporting Trump? One way of thinking about answering that question is these supporters are doing so because they're falling somewhere along this continuum that has to do with in-group racial identification, and somewhere along this continuum that has to do with right-wing political orientation. Obviously, these are continuous concepts and not categories. I'm only presenting it this way for ease of presentation. And obviously, there's overlap between the cells in these 2x2 tables. Again, I'm presenting stuff this way for ease of presentation. And I'm choosing excerpts that I argue help out with how we would illustrate these types of thinking among certain people. So if Black Trump supporters are defecting from racial norms because they're entrepreneurial, this excerpt we think speaks to that.
We don't need the media spoon-feeding us a narrative. We can think for ourselves, and we started thinking for ourselves. And when we look at Donald J. Trump, we see a man that never wavers, nor does he back down. And that's what we love. That's right. I love everything about Donald J. Trump. I love everything.
So there are many arguments about the motivations of Rochelle Richardson and Lynette Hardaway, Diamond and Silk, right? If you go to their webpage, it becomes pretty clear early on that they're making a ton of money, right? They might be making a ton of money because they are consistent in their hearts ideologically, but the truth of the matter is they're making a ton of money, right? And so we put Diamond and Silk in this category because the rhetoric suggests that it's not so much about racial in-group identification, and it's not so much about a hardcore commitment to conservative values, but the Trump effect or the charisma of the candidate combined with an opportunity to increase their professional profile might be some of the major motivators going into this. So Black Trump supporters might defect because they're entrepreneurial. Black Trump supporters might also defect, and I actually called this doctrinaire in a previous example. I don't know if convert is the right word, but these are folks that are more hard-lined ideologically, but not necessarily anchored by their racial identity.
witness. I think he is speaking to issues that a lot of Americans care about. And right now, there are very few people that are willing to stand up and push back against the destruction of America. And I think America is being destroyed. It's heading in the wrong direction. And there are very few people on the horizon that are willing to stand up and speak truth. And I think he does speak truth. And I have confidence that he will appoint people that are qualified to lead. And so I am going to support Donald Trump, and I would never, under any circumstances, support a Democrat. I don't see how any Christian could. I'm a Christian, and I would never, ever vote for that party.
Okay, that's provocative.
All right. So like I say, this is someone who doesn't necessarily matter which presidential candidate is coming out. This is a person who's staked their claim ideologically and they're doctrinaire in the sense that it's really about the values and about the platform, and that stuff is motivating primarily. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with race, which is why that person's at this part of the 2x2 table. Now, I want you to contrast the first two that I've shown you with what I'm going to call the iconoclastic Trump supporter.
Knows up to. We don't even have to answer that question because, yes, if there are celebrities that are willing to open the conversation to get people to think differently and to think critically, that's not pitching to a wagon. That wagon is going nowhere. Kanye didn't say, hey, everybody has to go for Trump. He said, I like Trump. Okay, he's allowed to like Trump. He gave everyone permission to like Trump if they like him. He also did not then say, I hate Hillary, right? He just said who he liked, right? So the idea that we're hitching to his wagon is false. We are embracing the fact that there are people that have pitched their wagons to the celebrity culture, and we're trying to do away with that. We're trying to let them know that it's okay to be an individual, it's okay to think differently, and yes, I embrace that completely.
And so when Candace Owens talks about celebrity culture, she's not only talking about the influence of the left and the celebrities on the left influencing the rank and file, but she's also talking about black culture and the default in black culture being aligned with the left in contemporary times. And she fashions herself as a free thinker. This doesn't show up in the video very much, but she grew up in a world where her grandfather used to protect her family from KKK interactions. So it's not like she's naive to the struggles of racial inequality. She just doesn't believe that she should fall in lockstep with the Democratic Party and with left ideas. And she's more than willing to help to blow that up. I'm sorry for this not being a C-SPAN video, but at some point, Gregory Cheadle will be online on C-SPAN too, I assume.
We had an African-American guy who was a fan of mine. Great fan, great guy. In fact, I want to find out what's going on with him. You know what look at my African-American over here. Look at that. Are you the greatest? You know what I'm talking about? Okay.
So this is an example of a person experienced, for lack of a better term, buyer's remorse, right? So Don Cheadle was actually up for election for state Congress in California coming up in, next month, and voted for Trump, not necessarily because he wanted to vote for Trump, but because he didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton. And if you go to Gregory Cheadle's website, you'll see that he's a dyed-in-the-wool Lincoln Republican. And one of his platforms is racial equality, and he's very critical. He was critical of the previous presidential administration because he didn't think Barack Obama went far enough to address issues of racial inequality in the country. And so this would be a person who's both highly racially identified and highly identified with his right-leaning political orientation, but behaviorally supported Trump, right? And we link at this because this is an important way of distinguishing a small number of people that we find to be very interesting. Now, for next steps, like I say, this is part of a broader project where we want to see if the insights from the oral histories that C-SPAN gives us access to help to inform hypotheses regarding the interaction between racial identification and political identification as a predictor of support for Trump. And this is a small sample study by definition. There aren't that many Trump supporters out there, right? So we were lucky enough to get access to the 2016 Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey, which has a large enough sample of African Americans to allow us to take some of these qualitative insights and export them into a survey-based multivariable style analysis that allows us to look at these dynamics. And so this is where we are. We appreciate the feedback that we can get, and we thank you for your time.
Is it okay if I stay seated? Or do you want me to stand?
I think it's up to you.
I know there are cameras. I can stand if needed.
Let me just get this up, and then I'll get out of your way because we have to switch back to our own.
We had some.
Thank you so much for having me. Special thanks to Robert and Connie for organizing this panel, because I really enjoy this conference every year. And I think these three papers are a great example of the many ways that you can use the C-SPAN archives and the different disciplines that these archives can really contribute to in terms of the scholarly conversations. And it's my pleasure to offer some comments on each of these papers. I would like to start by looking at Stephen Llano's paper, and the really fascinating, the longer paper is really interesting, and he makes a very compelling and convincing argument about the need to reevaluate how we discuss political debates. He demonstrates very clearly, and I think he did this in the presentation as well, that there tend to be two ways that scholars and especially journalists talk about presidential or about debates, and they overwhelmingly focus on presidential debates. That these should be a process of debate should be about informing people about issues, the merits of a particular policy to create a more informed electorate, and there's always this hope that this debate will finally bring information to voters so they can make a sound decision. But then there's the lamenting that happens, that it just becomes about this staged press conference. And it really doesn't actually do anything to inform the voters. And so he raises this question of, do we need debates when they prop up the two-party system and do little to inform voters? And he makes an argument that, yes, we do need debates. We need not just presidential debates, but these congressional debates as well. And if we adjust our analysis of what they do, what they provide us, and change the way we think about their value, then they can actually be really productive in how we think about candidates. And they're not so much as their understanding of the issues, but the vision and the framework that they're going to bring to office and what will likely shape how they perhaps perform once in office. So it was a really interesting paper. And again, I firmly agree with his analysis of how we should examine these debates. And I have a couple questions and ideas on ways to expand the analysis and thinking about where these ideas come from. I should warn you, I am a historian. So a lot of my recommendations in here are to think about the broader context and the historical development of some of these issues. So I think that the fact that he focused on the congressional debates and notably the special elections and the Texas race, this is really great because, as he notes, the majority of scholarship on debates focuses on presidential debates. And I think that this is a really important connection that I would encourage him to flesh out, the difference between presidential debates and congressional debates. And I actually don't know the answer to this, but I'm really curious as to when congressional candidates start to debate on national television or cable television. And I believe the answer probably is in the 1990s, in the new cable environment of the 1990s. And this is, of course, when C-SPAN plays a role, because it gives an outlet to candidates to not just talk to their local constituents and perhaps a town hall, but to talk to television viewers and to create a national name for themselves in the process of this debate. And I think that's really key here in terms of that connection between the local and the national. And again, my hunch is that, again, there's a really dramatic change in the 1990s. And I'm thinking about what Newt Gingrich brings to the forefront, especially in the 1994 Contract with America campaign when he nationalized the midterm elections. And this was something that was incredibly productive and efficient in terms of winning the House. And I think it really does shift the conversation and the rhetoric that's really at the forefront of congressional elections in the aftermath, because he made it about national issues, not necessarily just local issues. And then Republicans across the country really bought into that, and they talked about national issues with their local constituents, and they also knew when they were talking to their local constituents, they would potentially be talking to a national audience. And so I think that's a really important change in terms of the media politics of the 1990s that allows congressional conversations, electoral conversations, and potentially debates. Again, I don't know if the debates actually start to happen at this time, but I have a hunch that perhaps they did. And I think this is also key because if you think about the content of what they're talking about in midterm elections and through these congressional debates as well, because as you mentioned, overwhelmingly the conversation is about values. It's an identity, not about really specific localized issues. And this, again, is a shift in campaign strategy and rhetoric that's pioneered by Gingrich and other GOP congressional leaders during the 1990s. So it'd be really interesting, again, to see how debates fit into this. Do they become a tool to bring some basic ideas and structures from national campaigns? Again, are they modeling themselves after national presidential elections and trying to bring that strategy into more localized races? And again, these congressional races. So it'd be really interesting to see, who's shaping strategy, because you did show the similarity in terms of the structure in which they introduced the framework and their vision and the different and action, the way you laid it out. And because there's so much similarity, it makes me think that, again, they're getting a common playbook. They have a common playbook in terms of how they're advising their candidates to frame certain elections, to certain conversations. And is there a link between those playbooks? Where are they getting them from? And then finally, the last question, as you point out in the paper and in your presentation, the audience matters. And who the conception of the audience is also matters. And I think this is really key when you think about the different examples that you pulled out in the paper, that there are special elections and these really heated contests that people are looking to, national commentators, national party leaders are looking to as kind of a bellwether. Does this tell us kind of if the tides are turning? And notably, a lot of the elections that you pointed to are ones that are heavily funded by outside special interests as well, who see potential in that candidate, in that race, in that particular seat, or perhaps in the issues that are being debated. So again, are the candidates thinking, are they talking to their voters, or are they talking to outside funders? Are they talking to the national party where they hope that maybe they can make a national name for themselves, and even if they lose a Senate race, maybe it's the launch to their presidential campaign or something. So again, kind of thinking about the nuances of audience. And then finally, the commentary on the debates. I think you pointed that out, especially in your presentation. And I think that's really key in terms of who's talking about what's happening in the debates, how they're framing success and failure. And I think the C-SPAN library is actually really incredible for this, fleshing out, even with the call-in programs, all of the different commentary that is on, even on the weekends, when people are talking about what happened that week in politics, how are they commenting on debates? There are frequently also roundtables that are held that C-SPAN films about different experts, different political consultants who are talking about the value of debates as well. So I think kind of digging in deep through the archives and pulling out more of that commentary, because again, they're setting the parameters of that conversation. And I would just end by emphasizing that I would encourage you to not turn away from journalists and actually continue to tell them that it's not about who wins or loses, it's about the values. And I think trying to hammer that home in the public conversation is really important, because you really demonstrate the value of looking at these narratives that they're telling about themselves as candidates and how that could be useful. And if we can get that out to the public discourse, that would be fantastic. Farah Latif presents a really interesting and important analysis of political gaslighting. And there are some really interesting ideas in this paper about how and why information is manipulated for political gain. The paper itself talks a lot about fake news and gaslighting, and I would really encourage you to develop these points a bit more concretely, to show what's the difference between the two, because I think you allude to an important difference, and I think this is a really, really significant point to deepen in terms of the analysis, because you reference some of the histories about a fake news being something that has been introduced with the turn towards personality and spectacle and propaganda, frequently with the goal of increasing ratings and circulation. Where political gaslighting, you mentioned, is something that's very different, because it's not just about maybe selling more newspapers or getting higher ratings, but it's a strategic effort to undermine faith in institutions and authority. And that's a really important distinction to really flesh out. And again, you talk in the paper, and I would encourage you to expand on this a little bit, about how gaslighting has been used to prop up structures of inequality and violence, such as genocide and racial segregation and white supremacy. And so I think, to show the terms, what's at stake in terms of this question of gaslighting, if people are intentionally manipulating information to undermine trust in institutions, it has very undemocratic and perhaps violent even results, because it really is trying to introduce falsehoods to gain power with the illusion of public support. So again, really kind of fine-tuning the definition and the analysis about what gaslighting is and the threat that it really poses would help set up the research question and the imperative of the research question even more, because it's a great question. And I think climate change is the perfect way to get at this question, because as you mentioned, there is such a consensus in the scientific community about this, but yet this is a partisan issue. So why? And again, the C-SPAN library provides really unique perspectives to answer this question. So I have a couple ideas on how you could continue to use this archive to flesh out the strategies and this question of intent. Are people using this for very specific purposes, and how do we find that out? So first, I would encourage you to think about where congressional leaders, when they're making these statements, these presentations, when they're talking with scientists, where are they getting their information? They talk about, I have read, right? But where, if you could kind of dig deeper and find out where are they getting it? Frequently, it might be from think tanks, particular policy research that is then, again, circulated among the Republican Party in particular. Really fleshing out where they're getting that research would be very helpful. And then show how this compares to academic conversations about the issues. Again, C-SPAN can be useful when they have scholarly panels on certain topics that bring in scientists and kind of show the debate among scientists and how perhaps it's very different from the debate among politicians. politicians. You also talked a lot about LCB scores, and I wonder if you could kind of, again, bring in the funding question. You know, who are these candidates getting campaign donations from? Are they getting some donations from certain groups that, again, want to roll back regulations on the environment, and then does this kind of fit their narrative about climate change? And who are the demographics they're trying to appeal to in terms of voters? Are they trying to appeal to coal miners or certain or fishermen who are upset about certain regulations in some key areas of the Chesapeake Bay, as you mentioned? Would be really interesting to, again, kind of flesh out those different questions. And then finally, you mentioned that you may be harsh on Republicans in your paper. But I think that this is actually really, really key and really important to understand. And here's where I'm going to bring in my history a little bit. Because why does denial of climate change and even conspiratorial thinking behind it, why does it resonate with the Republican politicians and voters? And it's not an accident. And this is where there's a great literature on the history of conservatism that would be really, really useful to kind of show how these ideas in many ways are baked into the modern GOP. So I'm going to throw out 3 names of historians that I would strongly recommend that you look at. First is work by Nicole Hemmer on the history of conservative media. And she really talks about the ways in which the modern conservative movement created different discourse about facts, created new interpretation of what facts were in a way that was very purposeful to discredit the post-World War II legacy institutions, notably universities. So conservatives who really reshaped the party by the 1970s, attacked universities, attacked the scientific community because they believed that it was liberally biased and tried to develop their own facts and interpretation on certain issues. And she does a really good job of kind of fleshing out that why, again, that conspiratorial thinking would resonate and why conservatives are looking for their own facts to support their ideology. It's a historical development that would be really useful. Jason Stahl does a history of conservative think tanks, that again, you have these institutions that are developed to try to wage this ideological war that many conservatives believe that liberals are dominating in universities. And so again, they don't necessarily trust these academic communities. And the final one is Jefferson Decker, who looks at legal groups, particularly on the West Coast, and how they mobilize against a lot of these environmental regulations that came out of the 60s and 70s, and we're able to frame this debate as not about science, not about the human questions that you talked about, but about federal regulation and the government coming into their lives. And so, again, the way that's why issues like climate change have become so partisan. And he talks about the mobilization of lawyers to kind of change those legal definitions as well. And I realize I'm almost out of time, so I will just end quickly with Ray Block's really fascinating work on the oral history of African American Trump supporters. Your argument, the norms-based argument, is a really excellent one, and I think really effective. And especially, you know, one of the questions that emerge is this link between party identification and racial identification. And I wonder if you can, again, historicize it a little bit more. Because does this increase because of Obama, or does it perhaps increase because of the GOP response to Obama? And the way it emboldened, again, that more of what we would call white nationalism or the alt-right today, and the kind of the foregrounding of that racialized response to Obama. So that was one of the questions I had of that. But I also would encourage you to look at Leah Wright Rigueur. Are you familiar with her work at all? Okay, because I think that, again, she historicizes the mobilization of African Americans, or the Republican Party, to try to recruit African Americans into their party. And she talks a lot about this question of pragmatic politics, that many African Americans, beginning with Nixon's recruiting. Goldwater tried and was not very successful, but Nixon was actually relatively successful at bringing, I want to say 12% of the black vote, but I could be wrong. But she kind of charts out that he was actually making grounds. He reached out, before we have Kanye West, we have Sammy Davis Jr., who, gives Nixon a very infamous hug during the 1972 convention, and then had the wrath of the black community saying, why would you do this? And he emphasized, I believe in black capitalism. And I think that Nixon is good in terms of promoting economic opportunities for the African American community. And she also talks about how there's a tendency by the Republican Party to prioritize symbolic outreach gestures to the black community, like getting Kanye West or Sammy Davis Jr. or celebrities to visibly endorse the party's efforts, and even appointing high-ranking bureaucratic appointees. Nathan Connolly has written about this. But they haven't actually invested a lot of money into building outreach into these different communities and building the effort to kind of get out the vote in African American communities and sell Republican policies at the local level. So again, kind of historicizing this larger tradition. And, one of the things that also came up, and then I'll end, is that, this reference to the Democratic plantation, right? The iconoclastic voter. I think it's really interesting how the history of the Democratic Party has been used by a lot of black Trump supporters, Kanye West in particular, that he loves to remind people, give them a history lesson, which is really problematic, that remember, the Democratic Party was the party of segregation. This is Dinesh D'Souza, all right? That's also, advocating a particular view of history to kind of discredit the Democratic Party that, of course, overlooks the changes in the party and the civil rights movement in the 1960s. But again, how they're fueling these different narratives and trying to critique the Democratic Party and use that as justification, I think is a really important theme. So I will end there because I'm sure many people have great questions for these excellent papers, and I hope you'll join me in thanking them for presenting really exciting research.
Katie, we're going to ask you just to organize the Q&A and get things started and discussing, but we will ask people to come to the microphone because, as you know, this is a training, also a training session for students who are doing video, and so we want to make sure that your questions get on camera. The mic is right back here, right there in the middle.
Presenting your research. I really enjoyed hearing about today. I have a question for you, Stephen, with your research on debates and kind of building a framework for evaluating debates decoupled from the problematic did you win or did you lose. And I think that's a really great step in better understanding debates and how we might think about the narratives that emerge from those things. And so my question for you is, have you done any evaluative work about candidates who end up winning their elections and the components of the framework that emerge from the debates? For instance, do you see more of a reliance on the vision component, or do you see candidates using more of the action component, and that seems to resonate more with the audiences and result in perhaps a win for the election? Have you looked into that or thought into that at all?
That's a great question. The simple answer is no.
Okay.
But there are some disturbing sort of things that I've noticed as I do the work. One is that in all the debates I looked at, the people who did a much more de rigueur all four and mush them together in a way to say, look, I'm with you, but I'm also nationally with America, they all won their elections. So Eric Paulson won re-election in Minnesota 3. Connor Lamb won in Pennsylvania 18. And he did much better than Rick Saccone in that. And it looks like, if I'm right, Beto O'Rourke will win in Texas because he's the one doing a much better job than Ted Cruz. But this is all anecdotal. I think you raise an interesting question. My work hasn't necessarily been like, do they access this to win? I'm looking at more of an aspirational way of saying these are horrible events that discourage everyone from participating in politics. How can we make them more reflective and say, is this who, instead of they're right or they're factual, which I don't think is helpful, is this who we want to be? Is this who we are? They're much more of a mirror. Or even more complicated, is this who we'd like to tell others that we are? Because that's somewhat what's at stake when you have, your elected representatives on C-SPAN or on national television. And that's much more the Burkean identity. That takes a little bit more self-reflection, but I mean, I like the comment of talking to the journalists, but they hate this stuff. Because, they absolutely
nuance.
hate it. They're like, yeah, but who won? And I say, well, it's much more a question of, you guys all have your congressional representative. Is that who you want people associating with you? Is that who you aspirationally identify with? And that's kind of where I am, but I think it's a great question as far as the research goes. Anecdotally, there's a trend. If they do all four, they tend to win. The only exception is I did the Trump-Clinton, and Clinton seemed to be a little bit better at that. Yeah. And Trump was much, much more, as you could guess, on action and principle. He didn't have much of a plan, and he doesn't really know a lot about the world. And so framework and vision were absent. But the other two were there, but Clinton did the four thing. But, I mean, again, she won the popular vote, so maybe there's something there. It's a good question.
There seems like a great opportunity to build a framework for evaluation, so I encourage you to continue. But thank you for presenting that today.
No, great question. Thank you.
And if I may add something, maybe vision may have a little bit more to do with. It's all about the economy, idiot.
Yeah. That one could be, the Stephanopoulos, it's the economy stupid, the great Clinton campaign slogan that they had up in the campaign office. That could be a number of different things, couldn't it? That could be the term under which all four would be written. Like, that's your guiding principle when you sit down to write something. Look at that. It's the economy stupid. Write that.
Hi, I wanted to congratulate all three of you on 3 really interesting, really provocative papers. My question that I have, though, is for Mr. Block. I was really interested, sort of at the beginning you were talking a lot about, or you were hinting at sort of the role of the interplay of gender going on here. You said black men are 3 times more likely to vote conservative, or at least when you were looking at your sample, that they were 3 times more representative. But it was really interesting that in your examples, 3 out of 4 of them were of black women. I thought that was really fascinating. And so I'm just curious, what role does an analysis of gender play in your larger project? And thinking about that 2x2 matrix, what would something like throwing in high-low identification with like complementarian gender roles, how do you, from what you've seen so far, do you think that might be predictive, useful, or important?
So we're already planning on this for the quantitative portion of it, because this is a Trump election that we're studying. So even though the trends are pretty stable, we want to know how issues related to gender attitudes influence some of the stuff. So in addition to being able to cut the sample by gender, when we're looking at African-American respondents, we want to know how those African-American respondents score on some of the questions that are in the CMPS that deal with sexism. And so we don't know yet. But we know that whatever future statistical analyses that we run have to be informed by this conversation about gender dynamics. And it's a small sample for the representative excerpts I've got. It just so happens that 3 of the 4 really get to what it is that I'm trying to talk about. And so I'd imagine if I comb through C-SPAN a little more, that it'll probably start to look more representative of what the sample looks like overall. But I could also see a thing if there's a trend towards lionizing conservative black folk,
Yes.
right?
Absolutely.
It probably is more profitable to lionize a conservative black woman than it would be to lionize a conservative black man if you're thinking about the optics of things and you're a GOP candidate trying to seek out black support, or you're a GOP media source wanting to change the narrative among black voters.
Makes sense to me. Thank you.
Could you each talk about how you use the video? For example, did you have your framework, say in Stephen's case, and then you look for representative examples? Or, Farah, did you comb the video library and use that to develop your criteria? And maybe for Professor Block, how do you see the use of the video fitting with your quantitative analysis? I'm just sort of, if I can pull out sort of how the video fit into your papers.
Yeah, I can respond to that. I've had this idea kicking around as something I want to shop and test for a while now, because I think, I don't like presidential debates, but I think they're valuable. So what I did as far as a method goes with the C-SPAN videos is I saw a wealth of just untapped data because most scholars are not interested in congressional debates at all, even Senate debates, which you could argue particular Senate debates are more valuable than presidential elections sometimes because of what the Senate's responsible for. I thought it would be nice to find one debate that would be a baseline. That's the Minnesota 3. I thought that'd be pretty good. It's the start of the Trump era. I thought that would be a pretty good starting place. And then there are 2 special elections. I haven't really gone into the Georgia election that much. That was the other special election. But that Pennsylvania election was the first congressional election to get that huge amount of national attention in terms of from attention from the national parties and outside money and things like that. And that seemed to be a big test of whether or not all of the distasteful discourse that we're getting from Trump actually would translate into voter action or translate into some political reality. So that's what I did. I looked around. There's so many congressional debates on there that I could really write a book about this whole thing just based on that alone. And well, I'm thinking about doing it, but that was my method. I didn't look for ones that fit. I just thought, well, I'm going to use my 4, because this is very useful for political blogging, the 4 terms. I get a lot of retweets, and a lot of people are like using it in different other public address around the world for talking about American debates. So I thought, well, let's see if it holds up in these congressional debates. Because there's zero scholarship on congressional debates, aside from the history of like where they might come from. I know political debates as entertainment was popular in the 1930s on radio. Columbia Broadcasting System had a debate hour almost every day in the 30s, where they would have these little mini debates and stuff. But it's a good question. What I did was I just said, let's apply it to several of these, and we'll have a baseline, which is Bonoff and Paulson, and then we'll look to Lamb and Saccone, and then we can look to O'Rourke and Cruz for an even hotter one to see how they're doing. So that's my answer.
So I set out to do something new that I was still trying to learn myself and understand myself. So when I first started research, it was just putting in the input and looking for results, which was hundreds of results. But then I wanted to narrow it down to those congressmen that were that had some sort of commitment to climate change, and that narrowed me down to a few individuals. And as a result, I actually came up with only one result on C-SPAN archives, which speaks to it in itself about their commitment to climate change, whether they are supporting, whether they are presenting bills or not. I kind of went very zigzag way about it, writing this paper, but I had to decide between trying to distill through hundreds or kind of starting out from the point of there is a commitment and do we see that or not. And I said I saw very little, which was part of my results.
Shameless plug for the software that we use most of the time when we're making sense of this stuff. And so I'll be honest with you, the stuff on Black Trump supporters, it's not scholarly yet. So a lot of it was the blogosphere, which kind of sucks to get into, and a lot of journalistic accounts, usually by Black media sources, thinking about this stuff, but it all kept going back to norm violation. They weren't saying that these were people who were violating norms. They were saying things like these folks are crazy, or these folks have sold out their race, right? Things that suggest an argument about norm defection, right? So that brought us to the literature and economics on social identity and norms, and then that brought us back to political science, looking at some of the recent work that's experimental, looking at norm enforcement. And we had, I guess, 2 deductive codes, if you want to think about it that way. We wanted to look at how racial ID was talked about, and we wanted to look at how political ID was talked about. But we didn't have that 2x2 category system until we got into Deduce, right? And it was our ability to upload the videos and then go through them the way you would go through transcripts and highlight passages in the transcripts and think systematically about what that information was telling us that got us to that point. And so a lot of times when we're doing qualitative work, my spouse and co-author and I, we'll start pretty inductively in the sense that we won't try to prejudice the findings in any way. and we'll let codes emerge. But it was just too much we knew about this topic beforehand, and we could say in good conscience that we were coming in with a learner's eye about this stuff, but we still learned something in the process of actually manipulating the data and trying to bring that to the fore. And keep in mind too, like the fact that we haven't done a statistical analysis yet is actually good in this case, because we can use the qualitative stuff to truly inform the quantitative stuff as opposed to the other way around.
The idea of gaslighting, I think nobody wants to be part of that it's seen as dangerous, and we don't want to be afflicted by it, and we have the clinical psychology to show just how problematic it is. But I'm wondering, to what extent is there a willingness to be ignorant, to be gaslit by the broader public, and is that indicative of a bigger cultural neuroses? Because I have so many students, the whining when they had to give up their straws was pretty significant, and all these things that we would actually have to do to adjust our daily behavior, a lot of people don't want, and they want to be blissfully ignorant of the impact. And so to what extent are they gaslighting because people want to be gaslit?
Okay, so I would think of it as a very cyclical condition. The result of gaslighting is that we are left with inability to decide, and we refuse to make up our mind. We refuse to make a change. We refuse to have opinions. And so the result of gaslighting is that inability to be blissfully ignorant, right? And that kind of feeds into being becoming a gaslightee, and that's the enabling force, that's the enabling power of the gaslighter. So I don't know if that sufficiently answers your question, but somewhere there is lack of information and a lot of untruth and a lot of falsehoods that confuses us, and it just a repetitive cycle.
This is another question for Farah as well, which is, I guess, a little more broad, and I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on. So I guess this is sort of one way that we hear climate change deniers talked about, right, with kind of like ridicule and this idea that if we can get rid of the deniers, then we can actually make some progress on climate change policy. So I guess from your perspective, a lot of these Republicans who you're talking about, they might say things which are explicitly against climate change policy, but then in actuality, they're implementing things that look a lot like climate energy policies, right? So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on to what extent does it actually matter that people are saying, denierist claims about climate change if they're actually enacting the policies as well?
So from my sample, I found that there was very little that they were doing. Some of their policies that they were supporting pertain to their localities. They were not to, so my criteria for climate change versus environmental support was CO2 emission, Paris Climate Agreement, and a few key issues that support the global climate issue and not localized issues. So in that way, there was big failure.
I want to push back against that a tiny bit because I think there's a lot of policy which we could say are definitely like climate change policies that don't necessarily speak explicitly to climate change. So I guess that's, without having read your paper, maybe that's something just to think about more, right, as untying some of those knots of what that really looks like. Because I think there's a lot of literature which would suggest too that we can make very effective climate policy without having to have this debate about climate change, right? And having to talk about climate denial, where a lot of folks who do this kind of work are suggesting we don't even need to talk about climate change anymore, right? We can just leave that argument behind and instead focus on policy. But anyways, I'd be really interested to read your paper and hear more about your work.
Thank you.
My question is for the Haynes and Block paper. I'm curious, this is a part of a larger project. Are you interested in looking at Republican elite views and support for the president, particularly in Congress? So, of course, we have a handful of members of Congress who are African American and who are also Republican. And one way you could use the C-SPAN archives is to look at their levels of support for Trump on the House floor or in committees and his policies and things. And I'm curious if you're going to go in that direction at all.
We'll be very interested in doing that, actually. In fact, one of the things that we wanted to use this conference for is to think about how better to obtain information that will help us with the qualitative portion of the analyses. And so my gut reaction when Christina and I started this is that we would look at mass level stuff, right? So the prominent celebrities were the place that we went first, right? But elite doesn't have to be defined as celebrity in this case. It could be defined as office holders. And I don't see this stuff on Congress members who are Trump supporters being incompatible in any way with the arguments we're trying to put forward, and at the very least, it increases our sample size.
Be interesting too to see if there are differences in the ways in which they engage in support for the president, right? So is it policy based, or is it more policy based for elites in Congress versus more personality sort of connections, right? And kicking the bums out and draining the swamp and those sorts of issues. So great. I look forward to seeing that work come forward.
Looks like we are about out of time unless we have one quick question. Okay, then please join me in thanking our panelists for 3 superb papers.